14 men rode into the Arkansas wilderness hunting one escaped slave. None of them came back alive. For more than 100 years, their families believed the men had vanished in the war. But hidden court papers and old plantation ledgers tell a darker truth, of a man whose silence was more dangerous than any weapon, and whose revenge would turn Miller County into a place whispered about in fear. Part 1. The Blacksmith's Silence, 1,000 Words. In the year 1863, the people of Miller County, Arkansas, whispered about one name. It was written in plantation records, courthouse logs, and bounty notices, but never spoken out loud. The name was Bass. To most, he was just another runaway slave. But to those who had seen what he could do, Bass was something else entirely. Men who went after him didn't return. Dogs sent to track him vanished into the swamp. And every few weeks, someone would find the same mark carved into a tree near the Red River, a symbol shaped like a sickle. The locals started calling him the Reaper. But before he became the Reaper of Miller County, Bass was a blacksmith. Miller County, in the autumn of 1862, was barely under Confederate control. War had drained the land of young men and left behind overseers and old planters trying to keep their empires running. The Hutchins plantation stood on 4,000 acres of cotton fields, its white cypress house gleaming like a monument to cruelty. Robert Hutchins, the owner, believed himself a man of science. He kept ledgers that tracked everything from crop yields to the number of lashes each slave received for a given infraction. He called it calibrated discipline. He had designed his plantation like a machine, every man and woman a cog that could be measured, punished, or replaced. The blacksmith shop stood on the eastern edge of the property. Inside, under the smell of hot iron and sweat, worked Bass. He was a tall man, lean and silent, his eyes always lowered but his mind always turning. He could fix anything: locks, gates, tools, chains. He made horseshoes that never bent and hinges that never squeaked. The plantation's white blacksmith, a German named Otto Brenner, wrote to his brother in 1861. Greater than, the slave they call base has a mind like a machine. He can look at a broken lock and tell how it was made. He frightens me, though I cannot say why. There is something in his silence that feels dangerous. Bass spoke little. He followed orders, worked from dawn till dark, and kept his face empty. But the other slaves knew he was watching, counting patrols, memorizing guard routes, and studying the plantation like a map. Robert Hutchins thought he had broken Bass. In truth, he had trained him. Bass had been sold from Tennessee years earlier, after surviving a master who tried to crush his will with every form of punishment a man could invent. The scars across his back told that story. But beneath those scars lived something unbroken, something waiting. When the war came, whispers spread through the quarters that freedom was near. Union armies were pushing south, and runaway slaves were forming their own camps. But Bass never joined the talk. He kept working, eyes on the forge, hands steady as ever. Then came November 3, 1862. That morning, Hutchins decided to ride into the county seat at Texarkana. He was to settle a dispute over land boundaries and buy supplies. He took Bass along to handle the wagon and horses, a decision that would change Miller County forever. The streets of Texarkana were crowded with soldiers, merchants, and farmers. Bass waited by the wagon, motionless as his master entered the courthouse. The afternoon sun burned high, and dust hung thick in the air. When Hutchins came back out, papers in hand, he called for Bass to prepare the team. What happened next lasted less than 5 seconds. Bass reached into the wagon and lifted a bundle of heavy iron chains. With one clean motion, quick and sharp, like a blacksmith striking an anvil, he swung. The chains cracked against Hutchins's skull. The man dropped instantly, his papers scattering in the dirt. Bass didn't hesitate. He dropped the chains, grabbed a rope, a burlap sack, and climbed to the wagon seat. The horses bolted east, hoofs thundering against the road. Witnesses later swore it was like he vanished into the trees. Hutchins survived the blow, but his skull was fractured. He couldn't speak. His brother, enraged, offered $300 for Bass's capture, dead or alive. Within an hour, a group of 18 men gathered under the command of a seasoned slave catcher named William Taggart. Taggart was known across the South. He'd never failed a hunt. He carried a shotgun loaded with rock salt, cruel, but not deadly, and kept 6 trained dogs that could tear through swamp and forest like devils. He promised to bring Bass back in chains before sundown. But sundown came, and the men did not return. When night fell, distant gunfire echoed through the woods. Then silence. Days later, only the dogs were found, dead, their bodies arranged in a circle near the Sulphur River. No one dared search further. The swamps swallowed everything, even the truth. For years afterward, travelers spoke of strange shapes moving through the pine forests, of footsteps that followed them at night, and of fires that burned for no reason deep in the woods. The war ended, the plantations fell, but the legend of Bass, the Reaper of Miller County, never died. Because he wasn't hunting for freedom anymore. He was hunting for vengeance. Call to action. If you want to know what happened to the men who went after him, subscribe now. The story of the Reaper has only just begun. Title: The Reaper of Miller County, Part 2, The Hunt Turns Silent. Engaging hook. William Taggart thought he was the hunter. For 20 years, no fugitive had ever escaped him. But when he rode into the Arkansas wilderness after a runaway slave named Bass, the woods fell silent, and never gave his men back. What began as a chase turned into a nightmare of traps, shadows, and death. Part 2. The Hunt Turns Silent. 1,000 words. William Taggart had made a career out of catching men who ran. He'd hunted them through swamps, over mountains, across rivers and plantations. Some he dragged back in chains, others in coffins. He'd been shot, bitten, and nearly drowned, but he always came home. Until he met Bass. To Taggart, Bass was just another fugitive, a desperate man running blind through a land he didn't understand. A slave who had gotten lucky once and would soon be dead or back in chains. So on the night of November 3, 1862, Taggart gathered 18 armed men, 6 trained dogs, and rode out under the cold Arkansas moon to bring Bass down. He made one fatal mistake. He underestimated his prey. Taggart divided his men into 3 groups. 6 followed the main road east toward the Sulphur River. 6 others cut through the timber, hoping to flank Bass's trail. Taggart and the last group of 6 circled north to block any escape into Indian Territory. It was a solid plan, a textbook pursuit strategy. Against Bass, it was suicide. The first body was found 2 days later by a farmer checking his traps near a ravine. The man was Douglas Patterson, one of the timber riders. He was lying face up, eyes wide open, his neck crushed as if by a giant's hands. His rifle, pistol, and knife were gone. But what froze the farmer's blood was the way Patterson's body was arranged, arms stretched wide, like a warning to anyone who passed. When Taggart arrived at the scene, he crouched beside the corpse. He'd seen death before, but this was different. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no sign of a struggle, just silence. Taggart sent 2 men back to Texarkana for reinforcements and bloodhounds. The rest followed what they thought was Bass's trail through the woods. They camped that night near a creek, keeping watch in shifts. Every man sat with his rifle close and eyes wide open. By dawn, one of them was missing. They found him 20 yards from camp, dead, strangled by hand. His throat was bruised black, his weapons gone. It was then that William Taggart finally understood the truth. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was being hunted. Panic spread through the group, but Taggart forced the men to stay calm. "He's one man," he said. "One man can't take 18 of us." But his voice didn't sound like he believed it. Over the next 4 days, 11 more men died. The second team, the one following the main road, was found scattered across 3 miles of woods. 3 were strangled, 2 had their skulls smashed in with rocks or clubs, and 1 had drowned in 4 feet of water, pinned beneath the surface until the air left his lungs. Each body was missing weapons. Ammunition belts were empty. Bass wasn't running, he was collecting. Captain James Hardesty, a Confederate officer later brought in to investigate, wrote that Bass had displayed military precision. He had studied the hunters, predicted their movements, and used the land as his weapon. Every ambush was planned. Every death had purpose. Bass had even built traps, simple but deadly. A branch bent under tension, a hidden snare, a pit disguised by leaves. These were not random acts of violence. They were the work of a mind that understood physics, timing, and human fear. Taggart's men began to whisper that Bass could move through the trees without sound. That he could see in the dark. That he wasn't a man at all but something older, something the swamps themselves had given life to. By the night of November 8th, only Taggart and 3 men remained. Exhausted, hungry, and terrified, they made camp in a small clearing. They posted guards, tied the horses, and slept with their weapons in their hands. The forest around them was too quiet, no owls, no crickets, just whined through pine needles. When morning came, William Taggart was dead. The men found him lying in his bedroll, eyes open, the same mark carved into the tree above him, a small curve shaped like a sickle. His rifle and pistols were gone. None of the guards had heard a sound. Even the dogs hadn't barked. When the search party finally reached the camp 2 days later, led by Captain Hardesty and 23 armed soldiers, they found the same scene. Taggart's body undisturbed, his killer's tracks erased. Hardesty knelt beside the corpse and wrote in his report, "This fugitive demonstrates tactical skill beyond that of most soldiers I have commanded. He kills with purpose, he moves with patience, and he feels no hesitation. The question is not what kind of man he is, but what kind of fury drives him." Rumors spread quickly. Farmers refused to go into the woods after dark. Slave catchers stopped taking contracts in Miller County. And every so often, a traveler would find the same carved mark on a tree, always near an old campsite, always near the Red River. The locals began to say it out loud again. The Reaper had returned, and he wasn't finished. Call to action. The bloodshed was only beginning. In the next part, the Reaper's legend spreads beyond Miller County, and the hunt for him turns into something much darker. Subscribe now to follow the story. Title: The Reaper of Miller County, Part 3, Fire in the Cotton Fields. Engaging hook. By mid-November, the Reaper was no longer just a whisper in Miller County, he was a storm that no one could stop. 14 men were already dead. The hunters had become the hunted. But what came next would turn Bass Reeves from a fugitive into a symbol of vengeance and freedom, written in fire and blood across the Arkansas night. Part 3, Fire in the Cotton Fields, 1,000 words. The bounty on Bass Reeves had risen to $700. But even for that kind of money, no man in Miller County wanted the job anymore. The stories were too terrifying. Whole hunting parties wiped out. Camps found silent and empty except for cold fires and dead dogs. They called him the Reaper, but now people started adding a surname, Reeves. It meant bailiff or steward, an irony no one missed. The man who was once enslaved had become judge, jury, and executioner to those who called themselves the law. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Bass had been trained by a Confederate officer before his escape, learning military tactics. Others whispered that he'd lived among native tribes and learned their stealth and hunting ways. But the darkest stories said Bass had made a deal with something unholy, that he'd traded his soul for revenge. The truth was simpler, and far more terrifying. For 6 long years, Bass had lived in silence, beaten but observant. Every day, he watched his captors, how they moved, how they tracked, how they punished. He studied patrols, learned the sound of dogs before they barked, and the rhythm of men who believed themselves masters. The blacksmith's forge had taught him everything about strength and weakness, metal, bone, and the point where both break. When he finally escaped, he didn't run blindly. He had a plan. By late November, the Confederacy could no longer ignore what was happening in Miller County. 14 white men were dead, and the plantations were gripped with panic. If one enslaved man could do this, what message did it send to the thousands still in bondage? Captain James Hardesty returned to the region with 2 other Confederate officers. Together, they raised a force of 32 men, veterans, trained soldiers, armed with rifles and sabers. Their orders were simple: find the Reaper and end the nightmare. They scoured the forests between the Red River and the Sulphur, moving in tight formation, camping behind guarded perimeters, posting double sentries. But they found nothing, only traces, cold campfires, feathers from dressed game, boot prints that vanished into creeks. He was always there, just beyond their sight. A shadow among the trees. Hardesty's journal, found years later, revealed what Bass was really doing. He wasn't hiding from them. He was learning from them. While the soldiers swept through the woods, Bass moved closer to civilization, slipping along back roads and visiting small farms at night. He gathered food, information, and allies among the enslaved and the free black families who saw him not as a killer, but as a symbol. On November 28, he appeared at the home of a free black family named Rayburn, 10 miles south of the soldiers' line. He stepped from the dark carrying 2 rifles and a knife. The Rayburns would later describe him as calm, polite, but with eyes that held something deep, something haunted. He asked for food and news. They gave him cornbread and dried venison. In return, he asked questions about the war, about the patrols, and about the way east toward the Mississippi. The Rayburns told him of a settlement of runaway slaves protected by Union gunboats. Freedom was there, they said. 100 miles east. Dangerous miles. Bass listened quietly. Then he nodded. But instead of heading east, he turned back west, back toward the men hunting him. On the night of December 3, 1862, the Hutchins plantation burned. The fire started in the stables. Witnesses said it began as a thin orange line, then exploded into a roaring blaze that lit the cotton fields like daylight. Horses screamed and kicked against their stalls. Men shouted orders, buckets clattered, dogs barked. And in the chaos, Bass Reeves walked through the plantation like a ghost. He went straight to the punishment house, where 2 slaves were locked inside, awaiting a morning whipping for stealing food. Bass broke the lock with one blow from a hammer he'd carried since his days at the forge. He opened the door, told them to run, and disappeared into the smoke. The overseer, Harold Vickers, was the first to realize the fire was a distraction. He turned back from the stables, running toward the main house, and straight into Bass. The struggle was short and silent. By the time others arrived, Vickers was dead, strangled like all the others. Lying across his chest was a branding iron, the same one he had used to mark escaped slaves. When dawn came, the plantation was in ruins. 6 enslaved people were gone. So was Bass Reeves. That night, the story of the Reaper spread farther than ever before. Enslaved men whispered it in the fields. Women told it over cooking fires. Children learned his name before they learned their own. He was no longer just a man. He was proof that fear could change sides. For the white landowners, Bass Reeves became a nightmare made flesh. Patrols doubled. Guns were kept close. Sleep became a luxury. But for the Confederate command, Bass had become a dangerous symbol. His defiance threatened their control more than any Union soldier could. Captain Hardesty changed tactics. He stopped the direct pursuit. Instead, he ordered a network of checkpoints and sentries around every major road and river crossing. His plan was to starve Bass out, to make escape impossible. For 3 quiet weeks, it seemed to work. There were no attacks, no fires, no sign of the Reaper. Hardesty began to believe Bass was dead or dying in the woods. But Bass wasn't dying. He was adapting. Through whispers and coded messages passed from plantation to plantation, he learned everything: the patrol schedules, the weak spots in defenses, even the names of men guarding the roads. They called it the grapevine telegraph, an invisible network of voices spreading freedom through rumor. On December 18, a free black farmer named Samuel Hayes reported his identification papers stolen. It seemed like a small thing. But those papers allowed Bass to move freely in daylight, pretending to be a free man on business. 4 days later, on December 22, Bass crossed the Sulphur River disguised as Samuel Hayes. He timed the crossing perfectly, slipping through during a 40-minute gap when guards switched shifts. By Christmas Eve, he was 40 miles east of Miller County, beyond Confederate control, headed toward Union lines. The 6 he had freed from Hutchins' plantation were already scattered, hidden in safe houses and swamps. Bass had taught them how to survive. On January 7, 1863, Bass Reeves reached the Union camp of the 3rd United States Colored Troops. Soldiers recorded his arrival. When questioned, he calmly told the story of his escape and the 14 men he had killed. When asked if he felt guilt, Bass said, "I feel what any soldier feels after battle, relief that I lived and satisfaction that I finished the mission." The Union commander offered him enlistment. Bass accepted. The Reaper had found a new war to fight. Call to action. The Reaper escaped the South, but his legend didn't stop at the river. In the next part, Bass Reeves becomes a soldier, and faces a new kind of enemy. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. Hook. What if the hunted man, once a ghost in the southern woods, became a soldier whose name soldiers whispered with both awe and fear? Bass Reeves had crossed into Union lines, but his war was far from over. What began as an escape from bondage was now becoming something darker, a silent reckoning that would leave even the Union officers uneasy in his presence. Part 4: The Shadow Soldier. When Bass Reeves reached the Union camp in January 1863, the war for his freedom should have been over. But freedom, Bass quickly learned, had its own battles. He was given food, rest, and a uniform that didn't quite fit. Yet even among Union soldiers, men who fought against slavery, Bass felt eyes on him. Some saw him as a hero. Others whispered that he was a killer who didn't know when to stop. Colonel Thompson had Bass assigned to the 3rd United States Colored Troops. They were newly formed, made up of men who, like him, had escaped bondage. The colonel noted Bass's discipline and quiet nature. "He follows orders," Thompson wrote, "but moves as if he's always listening to something the rest of us can't hear." Bass rarely spoke, but when he did, it was direct, calm, and unsettlingly precise. His fellow soldiers soon learned that beneath that calm voice was a man who understood death in ways they couldn't imagine. He knew how to move through forests without sound, how to track by broken twigs and bent grass, how to vanish like smoke. The army used him as a scout. He rode ahead of patrols, moving alone for days through Confederate territory, returning with information about enemy positions and supply lines. His reports were so detailed and accurate that officers began to rely on them entirely. Yet even those who benefited from his skill admitted something about him felt unnatural. One night, in early spring, a Union corporal named Elias Turner followed Bass on a scouting mission. Turner was young, eager to learn from the man everyone whispered about. What he saw haunted him for the rest of his life. They moved through the woods near the Washita River, tracking a Confederate raiding party. Bass stopped suddenly, knelt, and pointed to a patch of soil. "5 men," he said. "They passed here an hour ago." Turner saw nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, but Bass moved forward as if following a glowing trail. When they reached a small clearing, Bass crouched low and whispered, "They'll camp here tonight." Turner didn't ask how he knew. He simply watched as Bass climbed into a tree, silent as a shadow. They waited. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, the raiders arrived exactly as Bass had predicted. Turner wanted to go back and alert the others, but Bass stopped him with a hand gesture. He waited, perfectly still, until the men began to sleep. Then he slipped from the tree and vanished into the dark. What happened next, Turner only heard. The muffled sounds of struggle, the snap of a branch, a gasp, then silence. When Bass returned, he carried 2 rifles and a satchel of maps. His expression hadn't changed. "They won't trouble us again," he said simply. Turner reported the incident to Colonel Thompson, who wrote in his journal, "Reeves acts with precision beyond training. I believe he was born for this work, or perhaps remade by his suffering into something that cannot feel fear." By the summer of 1863, Bass's reputation spread through the Union ranks. Soldiers called him the Shadow. Confederate scouts began telling tales of a man who moved without sound, whose eyes could see in the dark, who struck like an animal and disappeared. One story, passed between camps, told of a Confederate captain who set a trap for Bass using captured Union uniforms. The ambush failed. The captain was later found hanging upside down from a tree, his own sword driven through his chest. Some said Bass left him that way as a message. Others said the soldiers who found the body couldn't tell if it had been done by human hands. As months passed, Bass's assignments grew darker. He was sent to intercept couriers, sabotage supply wagons, and led small raiding parties into enemy territory. He never questioned orders, never hesitated, never seemed to rest. But those who fought beside him noticed something changing. He no longer spoke of freedom, or home, or God. When soldiers gathered around campfires, telling stories of the lives they hoped to return to, Bass sat apart, sharpening his blade or staring into the trees. It was as if he was listening for footsteps that never came. One night, a chaplain approached him and said softly, "You've won your freedom, son. You can stop fighting now." Bass didn't answer right away. Then he looked up and said, "Freedom isn't something you get, preacher. It's something you keep taking back." There was no sermon after that. By 1864, Bass had become a legend within the regiment. Commanders debated promoting him, but none wanted the responsibility. He wasn't a man they could command, only point in a direction and hope the mission was completed. When Union forces captured a Confederate outpost near the Red River, Bass was credited with leading the scouts who found the hidden approach path. But when soldiers entered the outpost, they found something horrifying. Every Confederate inside had been killed, without gunfire, without alarm. Many by strangulation, others by knife. It was the same method Bass had used in Arkansas. Colonel Thompson, now weary and gray, wrote one final note about him: "We have trained a soldier, but we've also unleashed a ghost. The war will end, but I wonder if Bass Reeves ever will." As the Union flag rose over the outpost, Bass stood apart from the cheering men, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. For him, the war was not over. It had simply changed its shape. Because deep inside him, something had awakened in those Arkansas woods, something that no uniform, no victory, and no peace could silence. And as winter approached once more, whispers spread through the camps. The shadow rides again. The true terror, it seemed, had just begun. End of Part 4. Hook. What happens when a man born in chains becomes the most feared name on both sides of a war? Bass Reeves had fought his way out of slavery, through the wilderness, and into the Union Army. But freedom hadn't softened him, it had sharpened him. What began as survival was now turning into something else, something darker. And by the winter of 1864, even his allies began to fear the silence that followed wherever he went. Part 5: The Reckoning of Bass Reeves. The Red River Outpost massacre spread through the Union camps like wildfire. Men whispered about the ghost soldier who'd taken the fort without firing a single shot. Officers refused to write official reports, afraid of how it would look if they admitted that one man had done what an entire regiment could not. Some called it a miracle of strategy. Others, a horror. Colonel Thompson tried to protect Bass. He told his superiors that the killings were acts of war, justified under battlefield law. But when the inspectors arrived and saw the bodies, faces locked in silent terror, throats crushed, weapons untouched, they didn't see a soldier. They saw something beyond their control. Bass said little during questioning. He sat upright, hands folded, eyes calm. When asked why the men had been killed instead of captured, he said, "They were armed. I removed the threat." No emotion, no defense, just a statement of fact. Afterward, the officers met privately. Some wanted him discharged, others executed. But Thompson argued that the army couldn't afford to lose a man like Bass. They agreed to a compromise: keep him under supervision and restrict him to scouting duty only. For the next several months, Bass worked alone again, deep in enemy territory, his reports reaching camp through couriers who never saw him. Each message was brief, precise, written in block letters: troop numbers, positions, ammunition stores. But with each report came another mystery: Confederate patrols disappearing, camps found abandoned, wagons discovered burned and looted. The soldiers started to believe that Bass wasn't scouting anymore. He was hunting. By April 1864, the war in Arkansas had turned desperate. Confederate forces were retreating, and small groups of soldiers were left behind to raid Union supply lines. Bass was ordered to intercept one such group near Lake Village, 12 men known for brutal attacks on freedmen. He went in alone. 3 days later, Union troops found the raiders' camp. Every man was dead. Their throats were crushed, their rifles missing. In the ashes of their fire lay something no one could explain: their Confederate flag, folded neatly beside a blood-stained Union cartridge belt. Colonel Thompson ordered Bass back to headquarters for evaluation. When the courier reached him, Bass simply said, "There's still work to do," and vanished again. That summer, a young lieutenant named Henry March was sent to find him. March rode for 3 days through flooded fields and thick forest before finding Bass camped beside a half-burned church. He was cleaning his rifle, his eyes calm and distant. "The colonel wants you back," March said carefully. Bass looked up. "The colonel doesn't need me back. He needs me to keep the night quiet." "What do you mean?" Bass pointed toward the tree line. "They're out there. The ones who burn fields and hang the men who work them. I stop them. That's all." The lieutenant swallowed hard. "You're one man, Reeves." Bass's expression didn't change. One is enough when he stops waiting for permission. March returned alone. By autumn, stories of Bass Reeves had spread beyond the army. Confederate scouts refused to patrol after dark. Civilians claimed to see a rider dressed in Union blue, moving silently through the fog. Some said he carried no light because his eyes could see in the dark. Others swore his horse left no tracks. One farmer, an old man named Josiah Briggs, told a story that made its way into army rumor for years. He said Bass came to his door one night asking for food and water. Briggs gave him what little he had. Before leaving, Bass looked toward the woods and said, "They're coming for you." Hours later, Confederate raiders appeared, demanding supplies. They were dead before dawn, their bodies left in a circle outside the farmhouse. Briggs never saw Bass again. By the winter of 1864, the war was nearing its end, but Bass seemed unchanged. When orders came for his regiment to move north, he didn't follow. He stayed behind in Arkansas, saying he had unfinished business. Colonel Thompson sent another message, pleading with him to return. "You've done enough," he wrote. "The war is almost over. Let it end for you, too." Bass didn't reply. Instead, he rode south into the forests near Miller County, the same wilderness where his story had begun. What he found there wasn't an army or a patrol. It was a plantation, a name he hadn't heard in years. Hutchins. The plantation had been rebuilt, smaller now but still standing. Robert Hutchins, scarred and broken but alive, had returned after the war to reclaim what he'd lost. The night Bass arrived, the workers whispered that they saw a tall man standing by the fields, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. At midnight, the dogs began to bark. Then the horses screamed. By dawn, the Hutchins plantation was ash. Hutchins himself was found in the ruins of his house, strangled beside the burned remains of his ledger books. The sheriff who investigated wrote that the scene showed no evidence of theft or looting, only deliberate destruction. Union officials called it an act of revenge. Locals called it justice. But among the soldiers who had served with him, there was silence. They knew Bass Reeves didn't act from anger. He acted with purpose. When Colonel Thompson received the report, he closed his notebook and said quietly, "He's not one of us anymore. He belongs to whatever darkness made him survive." After that winter, Bass disappeared again. No more reports. No more sightings. Only stories. Stories that traveled from Arkansas to Texas, from freedmen camps to army posts. They said a man was riding through the night, silent, unstoppable, hunting the ones who still trafficked in flesh and chains. Some called him a ghost. Others, an angel. But those who had met him, those who had seen his eyes in the firelight, said Bass Reeves was still a man, one who had learned to walk the line between justice and vengeance, and found no difference left between them. The war might have been ending. But for Bass Reeves, the real reckoning had just begun. End of Part 5. Hook. Sometimes, when the wind passed through the old chimneys of Rutledge Plantation, it carried voices, soft, broken whispers that didn't belong to the living. And that night, Amelia Rutledge finally understood what they had been trying to say all along. Part 6. The storm rolled in without warning. Lightning flashed across the horizon, lighting up the cracked windows of the great hall. Amelia stood in the doorway, her candle trembling in her hand. The shadows of her ancestors' portraits seemed to flicker with strange life, their painted eyes following her every step. Behind her, the floorboards groaned, slow, heavy footsteps that matched her heartbeat. She turned sharply, but no one was there. Only the long corridor stretched into darkness, filled with the faint sound of whispering. She wasn't alone. The diary she had found in the library lay open on the floor, its pages soaked from her tears. The words written by her great-grandmother, Eleanor Rutledge, were clearer now than before. "We built this house on cursed land. The blood that was spilled cries for remembrance." Amelia knelt, her hand shaking as she traced the faded ink. The truth was buried under the estate, literally. She had seen the ground near the orchard, where the earth looked uneven, as if something, or someone, had been buried there long ago. As thunder cracked, the front door slammed shut. Every candle in the hall flickered out at once. The mansion plunged into black silence. Then came the sound of chains dragging across the marble floor. "Who's there?" Amelia whispered. The voice that answered was neither man nor woman. It was deep, echoing, full of sorrow and rage. "You wear her face." Amelia froze. "Who?" The air grew colder. A shadow took form at the top of the stairs, tall, cloaked, and human-shaped. The lightning flashed again, revealing a hollow face with eyes that glowed like dying embers. "Eleanor's bloodline must pay," it whispered. Amelia backed away, her candle useless now. "What do you want from me?" "To finish what she began," the voice said. The chandelier above her rattled violently before crashing to the floor, scattering glass across the room. Amelia screamed and ran, her feet slipping on the polished wood. She darted into the servants' corridor, a narrow, forgotten passage that smelled of damp stone and dust. She could hear the footsteps following. Slow, deliberate. At the end of the passage was an old wooden door. She pushed it open and stumbled into the basement. The air was thick, heavy with mold and age. Her candle flickered weakly as she scanned the room. There were crates, old tools, and something else. In the far corner stood a figure, motionless, head tilted slightly to the side. It was a woman. The shape was faint, almost transparent, but the gown she wore shimmered faintly in the dim light. Her face was familiar, so familiar it made Amelia's blood run cold. It was the same face from the portrait in the great hall. "Eleanor," Amelia whispered. The ghost turned her head slowly. Her expression was both mournful and pleading. "You shouldn't have come here. I had to know the truth," Amelia said, voice trembling. "What happened to you?" Eleanor's lips parted, but before she could answer, the air behind Amelia shifted, the heavy presence returned. The same voice spoke again, closer this time. "She betrayed us." Amelia turned to see the dark figure stepping into the light, revealing a soldier's tattered uniform, Union blue, dirt-stained and torn. His eyes burned with hatred. Eleanor's ghost lifted her hand. "No, please. It was my choice, not hers." But the soldier raised his arm, and the chains around his body began to move on their own, slithering across the ground toward Amelia. Panicking, she stumbled backward, knocking over a lantern. Flames burst across the floor, spreading fast. Smoke filled the basement, and the ghostly figures flickered in and out of sight. Eleanor's voice pierced through the chaos. "Find the graves beneath the orchard. Set them free." Amelia coughed, the fire roaring around her. "How?" "Dig," Eleanor said faintly. "Before the next moon." The soldier's shadow lunged forward, his burning eyes inches from hers, then the fire surged, swallowing him whole. Amelia ran for the stairs, her lungs burning, her hands blackened with soot. When she burst out into the night air, rain was pouring down. She collapsed in the mud, gasping for breath. Behind her, the mansion glowed with orange firelight, its windows blazing like angry eyes. But even through the storm, Amelia could hear them, the voices of the dead, crying from the orchard. She turned her head toward the trees. The ground there pulsed faintly, as if something beneath it was stirring. Amelia wiped the ash from her face and whispered to herself, "Then I'll dig." She rose to her feet, clutching the diary to her chest, and walked toward the orchard as lightning split the sky once more. The storm had just begun, and so had the reckoning. Hook. When Amelia Rutledge struck the first blow of her shovel into the rain-soaked orchard, she thought she was uncovering history. But with each scoop of mud, she realized she was waking something that had been waiting far too long to rise again. Part 7. The night was still heavy with storm clouds when Amelia began digging. The ground was soft from the rain, and each thrust of the shovel sent a dull thud into the earth. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the diary clutched tightly in her coat pocket. She could still hear Eleanor's voice echoing in her head, "Find the graves beneath the orchard. Set them free." The orchard trees loomed around her like dark sentinels, their twisted branches dripping water and whispering in the wind. Lightning flashed again, and for a split second, Amelia thought she saw shapes standing between the trees, pale outlines, watching. She shook her head and kept digging. After what felt like an hour, the shovel struck something solid. Wood. Amelia froze. She knelt down and brushed the mud away with trembling fingers until she uncovered the edge of an old wooden box. No, not a box. A coffin. Her heart pounded as she cleared more dirt. The wood was blackened and soft, as though time itself had been eating it away. Carefully, she pried open the lid. Inside lay bones, fragile and yellowed, wrapped in what remained of tattered fabric. Around the skeleton's wrist hung a rusted chain. Beside it, something shimmered faintly, a small silver locket. Amelia picked it up. The moment her skin touched it, the wind died. The rain stopped. The entire orchard went still. Then she heard the whisper, so close it felt like it was inside her head. "Free us." The ground trembled beneath her knees. She dropped the locket, stumbling backward. The other graves, dozens of them, began to reveal themselves, small mounds shifting as though something underneath was moving. From the distance, the mansion's bell began to ring by itself. Its hollow toll echoed across the field. Amelia's body shook. "What do you want?" she cried into the storm. A voice answered, deep and mournful. "Justice." The earth split open. From the first grave, a faint mist rose, forming into the outline of a man in a soldier's uniform. Then another, and another. The orchard filled with ghostly figures, their hollow eyes fixed on her. One stepped forward, his face burned and pale. "You bear the Rutledge name," he said. "Do you know what your family did here?" Amelia's voice quivered. "I don't, but I want to." He raised his hand, and suddenly the world around her blurred. The rain faded. The trees vanished. In their place stood the same orchard, but alive, lush and bright, under a sun that wasn't there a moment ago. Amelia blinked. She was seeing the past. Men worked under the trees, chained by the wrists and ankles, their backs bent with exhaustion. Overseers shouted orders while the grand mansion stood tall in the distance. Among them walked a young woman, Eleanor Rutledge, carrying a small notebook and speaking softly to one of the men in chains. "She tried to help us," the ghostly soldier said beside Amelia. "But when they found out, her own father ordered our deaths. They buried us here, beneath the orchard she loved most." Amelia felt a chill deep in her bones. "And Eleanor, she cursed the land with her last breath," the ghost said. Promising that one day, her bloodline would set things right. The vision shattered, and Amelia was back in the cold, muddy orchard, surrounded by restless spirits. "I can help you," she said, gripping the shovel like a weapon. "Tell me how to end this." The soldier pointed toward the mansion. "The truth lies beneath the chapel." The priest knew. "The records are there." Before she could respond, a distant scream echoed from the direction of the house. It was a man's voice, raw and terrified. The ghosts turned toward the sound, then slowly began to fade, sinking back into the mist. Amelia ran toward the mansion, the diary thudding against her chest with every step. When she reached the porch, she saw the door wide open, swinging on its hinges. Muddy footprints led inside, fresh ones. Someone else was there. She stepped inside, heart pounding. The hall was dark except for the faint glow of a candle at the far end. "Who's there?" she called out. No answer, only the sound of dripping water and the creak of the old staircase. Amelia followed the candlelight into the parlor. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, and froze. There, sitting in Eleanor's old chair, was a man she had never seen before. He was tall, his clothes soaked from the rain, and his eyes sharp as glass. "You must be Amelia Rutledge," he said with a faint smile. "I've been waiting for you." Her throat tightened. "Who are you?" He leaned forward, the candlelight revealing a scar across his cheek. "Let's just say, I'm someone who's been watching your family for a very long time." What do you want? She asked. He stood up slowly, picking up Eleanor's diary from the table. The same thing you do, the truth. But I'm afraid the truth won't set you free, Miss Rutledge. He smiled again, dark and knowing. It'll destroy you. The candle flickered violently, and in that moment, Amelia saw something impossible in his eyes, reflections of fire, graves, and chains. Before she could move, the man whispered, "They're not done with you yet." Then the lights went out. Somewhere above, the mansion's bell began to toll again. Hook. The firelight flickered against the cracked walls of the Rutledge Mansion as Amelia realized she was no longer alone in her bloodline's curse. The man who claimed to be her ally knew too much, and his eyes held the kind of knowledge that only the dead should possess. Part 8. The storm had moved east by morning, leaving behind a mist that wrapped the trees in pale gray shrouds. Amelia stood at the window, staring out over the orchard. The ground she had disturbed last night looked darker than the rest, a scar upon the earth. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces, the men in chains, Eleanor's frightened eyes, the soldier's outstretched hand. Behind her, the stranger moved quietly through the parlor, examining the relics that filled the old mansion. He handled them like a man searching for something specific, though he never said what. "You never told me your name," Amelia said finally. He turned toward her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Hardesty. Captain James Hardesty, Confederate Army. Retired, but not by choice." She frowned. "I've heard that name. In one of the old county records, there was a mention of a Captain Hardesty leading a search party in 1865. Something about a fugitive in these woods." He nodded slowly. "That was me. I tracked a man named Bass. The most dangerous man I ever hunted. But after what I saw in these hills, I stopped hunting altogether." Amelia studied him closely. There was a haunted look in his eyes, like someone carrying the memory of too many graves. "Why are you here now?" she asked. He walked toward the fireplace, resting one hand on the mantel. "Because the past doesn't stay buried here, Miss Rutledge. And your family's sins run deeper than you think. The man I was chasing, Bass, he wasn't just running from men like me. He was running from something your ancestors created." Amelia's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Hardesty didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper. He laid it on the table between them. It was a hand-drawn map, an old one, showing the land beneath the mansion. "Beneath the orchard. Beneath everything. There's a chamber under the chapel," he said. "Hidden behind the altar. I saw it once, years ago, before I had sense enough to leave this place. Your great-grandfather built it during the war. It was used to hide things." "What kind of things?" Amelia whispered. He looked at her, his face grim. "Experiments. Human ones. They called it salvation. I called it madness." The room seemed to grow colder. Amelia's breath trembled. "That's impossible, is it?" Hardesty asked softly. "You saw the graves yourself. The chains. The ghosts. Do you really think all that came from simple cruelty?" "No, there was something darker here. Something that twisted faith into something monstrous." Amelia turned toward the diary resting on the table. Eleanor's final words still haunted her. The blood must answer for what it began. "What happened down there?" she asked. Hardesty hesitated. "I'll show you." They took lanterns and made their way to the chapel at the edge of the property. The small stone building had been half swallowed by vines and moss, its bell tower leaning like a dying sentinel. Inside, dust covered the pews, and sunlight filtered through broken stained glass, painting the cracked floor in red and gold. The altar stood untouched, though the wood had darkened with age. Hardesty knelt beside it, brushing away debris until he found what he was looking for, a small iron ring embedded in the floor. With a grunt, he pulled it upward. A hidden trapdoor creaked open, releasing a gust of stale air that smelled like rot and earth. Amelia shivered. "This was here the whole time." "Since the 1840s, Hardesty said. "Your family never worshipped here." "Not really." They descended the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were carved stone, damp and slick beneath their fingertips. At the bottom, the passage widened into a chamber lined with wooden tables, rusted chains, and iron instruments whose purposes Amelia didn't want to imagine. Her lantern flickered over words scratched into the stone, Latin phrases mixed with English prayers. Beneath one, a name, Eleanor Rutledge. Amelia's throat tightened. She was here. Hardesty's lantern revealed something else at the far end of the room, a massive wooden door reinforced with metal bands. Strange symbols were burned into its surface, and from the cracks between the planks, something like smoke seemed to seep out. He lowered his voice. They called it the Chamber of Redemption. The moment he said it, the symbols began to glow faintly, pulsing with an eerie red light. The floor beneath their feet vibrated. "Get back," Hardesty barked, stepping between her and the door. But it was too late. The wood splintered outward with a deafening crack. A wave of cold air burst into the chamber, carrying with it a whispering chorus of voices. The lanterns went out. In the darkness, Amelia could hear them, the cries of men and women, the rattling of chains, the echo of prayers that turned into screams. Something moved in the blackness, brushing past her arm. She gasped and reached for Hardesty, but her hand met only air. "James," she called. His voice came back faintly, distant, as though from the other side of a wall. "Run, Amelia. Don't let them take you." The ground cracked open beneath her feet, and the chamber erupted with sound, hundreds of voices, crying out her name. Amelia stumbled toward the stairs, but the passage had collapsed. The only light came from the glowing door, now standing wide open. And in its center, something was stepping through. It wasn't a ghost, nor a man. It was a shadow made flesh, its form shifting and breathing, its eyes like molten gold. Amelia could feel its gaze pierce her chest. The whispering stopped. Then it spoke, its voice deep and hollow. "Eleanor failed me," it said. "Will you?" Amelia's knees nearly gave out. "Who are you?" It smiled, a terrible, human smile. "The first sin of the Rutledge bloodline." The lanterns flickered back to life for a single heartbeat, and Amelia saw what lay beyond the door, rows of bones, bound in iron chains, their skulls facing the entrance. Then the light went out again, and the last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of her own name whispered by 100 dead tongues. "Hook." Amelia's scream echoed through the hollow corridors of the Rutledge Mansion, but it was swallowed by shadows far older and darker than the storm outside. The spirits that had lain dormant for generations were stirring, and some sins refused to be buried. Part 9. Amelia awoke to cold stone beneath her and the faint scent of damp decay in her nostrils. The chamber under the chapel had claimed her, and for a moment she wasn't sure if she was alive or already part of the horrors it held. Her lantern lay shattered at her side, the faint glow of the door outside providing the only light. The shadowy figure had vanished, or perhaps it had simply retreated into the depths of the chamber, but its presence lingered, a heavy weight pressing against her chest. Amelia's breath came in ragged bursts. She pulled herself to her feet, gripping a fallen iron rod for support. Every step she took made the floor groan, as if the mansion itself were warning her to leave. Her mind raced. The diary, Eleanor's last words, Hardesty's warnings, they all converged into a single, terrifying truth. The Rutledge bloodline had awakened something ancient, something that fed on fear, secrets, and betrayal. And now it had her attention. A distant clatter echoed through the chamber, making her spin around. Shadows stretched along the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost human. She stumbled backward and collided with a stack of old wooden crates. Papers scattered across the floor, and she bent down, recognizing old ledger books and letters from centuries past. As she flipped through them, a pattern emerged. Her ancestors had not just enslaved and punished, they had experimented, using fear and pain as tools to create obedience. They had dabbled in rituals, combining old religious rites with dark arts whispered about in secret societies. Eleanor had resisted, trying to protect those imprisoned beneath the orchard, but she had failed. Her death had left a legacy of anger, grief, and something far worse, an entity forged by the suffering of hundreds. The shadows shifted again. This time, they coalesced into a form she recognized. It was the soldier from the orchard, his face pale and eyes haunted, but now more solid, more real than ever before. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice echoing off the stone walls. "I have to finish this," Amelia replied, her hands trembling but her voice steady. I can't let it continue. He shook his head slowly. You don't understand. This isn't just a haunting. This is the consequence of your family's sins. You can't just dig it up and expect it to disappear. Amelia swallowed hard. Then how do I stop it? The soldier hesitated. You need a sacrifice. A truth revealed. Someone has to confront the pain, the cruelty, and accept it. Only then can this end. Before she could respond, the chamber shuddered violently. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. The shadows on the walls moved faster now, writhing and whispering in a chorus of voices that chilled her blood. Show yourself, Amelia shouted, clutching the iron rod. I'm not afraid of you. A gust of icy air swept through the chamber, extinguishing the faint light from the door. The whispers grew louder, some words distinct, others a growl of suffering, blood, justice, betrayal, Rutledge, Amelia. Then the shadow reappeared, larger and more menacing than before. Its golden eyes glowed in the darkness, and its form seemed to flicker between human and something entirely otherworldly. You carry the bloodline, it said, voice hollow and resonant. Will you accept it, or will you run? Amelia steadied herself. I will accept it. Whatever it takes, I will end this. The entity paused, and the room went silent. Then it began to speak again, recounting the horrors committed beneath the mansion, the chains that bit into flesh, the rituals performed to instill obedience, the cries that had gone unheard for generations. Amelia listened, each word striking her like a hammer. She realized she was hearing the voice of every victim, every soul wronged by the Rutledge family. Her hands shook, but she didn't break her gaze. I see you, she said. I see everything. I will not forget. I will not let this continue. The shadows convulsed, twisting violently, and then, slowly, they began to dissolve. The golden eyes dimmed, and the voices faded. The chamber grew still once more. Amelia dropped to her knees, gasping for air. A soft light began to seep through the broken lanterns and cracks in the ceiling. Dust floated in the rays, illuminating the chamber in a way that made the horrors of the past tangible yet strangely serene. The spirits had not vanished. They had been acknowledged, recognized, and released from the torment that had bound them. Amelia rose, exhausted but resolute. She picked up the scattered ledger books and letters, planning to take them to a historian who could preserve the truth. The mansion no longer felt hostile, though the weight of history remained. She had confronted the darkness, faced the consequences of her ancestors' actions, and survived. As she climbed the steps toward the chapel, the first rays of sunlight broke through the morning fog. The orchard outside appeared calm, peaceful, as if it were breathing again. Amelia paused at the top of the staircase, looking down at the path she had walked. The land had scars, but the worst of its secrets had been unearthed, and in exposing them, she had set the foundation for redemption. The mansion behind her seemed less menacing now. The echoes of the past had spoken, and she had listened. She knew this story would live on, not just as a warning, but as proof that confronting darkness, no matter how ancient or terrible, was the only path to freedom. Amelia stepped into the sunlight, feeling the weight of generations lift from her shoulders. She knew the final confrontation was near. Only one piece remained, the truth about what had happened to Eleanor, and what had become of the entity that had haunted her bloodline. With the diary tucked under her arm and the last ledger clutched in her hand, Amelia walked toward the forest at the edge of the orchard. Somewhere in the shadows, the final secret waited. And she was ready to face it. Hook. The wind howled through the ruins of the Rutledge Mansion, carrying whispers that had been buried for over a century. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak a warning, and at the heart of it all, Amelia was about to uncover the truth that would bind the past and present together forever. Part 10. Amelia approached the final chamber with cautious steps, the diary clutched tightly in one hand and the ledger in the other. Every nerve in her body was alert. She had faced shadows, horrors, and the restless spirits of her ancestors, but she knew the ultimate secret of the Rutledge Mansion awaited her here. The last piece of the puzzle that had haunted her family for generations. The door to the chamber groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty, or so it appeared at first glance. Dust motes floated in the weak sunlight streaming through cracks in the boarded windows. The air smelled of decay and old smoke, but beneath it, Amelia detected a faint, almost metallic scent, like blood long dried yet never forgotten. At the center of the room lay a large, stone pedestal. Resting atop it was a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift when she looked at them. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the lid, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the light and plunging her into darkness. A voice echoed, low and resonant, filling the chamber. "You have come far, Amelia Rutledge. Are you ready to face the truth of your bloodline?" "I am," she replied, though her voice wavered. She knew the answer, but hearing it spoken aloud made her heart pound. The box creaked open. Inside were dozens of letters, photographs, and artifacts from the Rutledge family archives, documents detailing every act of cruelty, every ritual, every punishment and experiment carried out on the enslaved people they had kept. But there was one item that drew her attention, a small, faded journal belonging to Eleanor Rutledge herself. Amelia opened the journal and began to read. Eleanor's handwriting was meticulous, filled with anguish and fear, but also defiance. The entries recounted her attempts to shield the victims from her family's cruel experiments and her desperate plans to escape. And then, near the final pages, the writing changed, descriptions of shadows moving with intent, whispers that guided her, a presence that seemed both protective and warning. Amelia realized the truth. Eleanor had been in contact with the same entity that haunted the mansion now. It had been bound by the anger and suffering of those enslaved, but it had also responded to acts of compassion and courage. Eleanor's spirit had tried to help, guiding anyone who might survive to confront the darkness. A sudden noise made Amelia freeze. The shadows in the room stretched, forming shapes she recognized, the faces of the Rutledge ancestors, twisted and grim, watching her. Fear rose in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You cannot undo what has been done," the shadows hissed. "The pain, the blood, the betrayal, it lives within you now." "I do not seek to undo it," Amelia said firmly. "I seek to end it. I am here to set the truth free, to give voices to those who were silenced." The shadows writhed and convulsed, then slowly receded. A figure emerged from the darkness, solid yet ethereal. It was Eleanor, her eyes glowing faintly, her presence commanding yet serene. "You have done well to come this far," Eleanor said. "But the final act requires more than courage. It requires acknowledgement, confession, and acceptance. Are you willing to bear the weight of your ancestors' sins?" Amelia nodded, her grip on the diary tightening. "I am." Eleanor extended her hand, and a soft light enveloped the chamber. The letters, photographs, and ledger began to float, circling Amelia as though drawn by an unseen current. Voices rose in unison, the spirits of the enslaved, whispering their stories, their pain, their names, until the room seemed alive with the echoes of the past. Amelia read aloud from the ledger, naming each victim, describing the horrors committed, acknowledging the pain and suffering. As she spoke, the shadows shifted again, this time into the forms of those who had suffered, and they began to glow faintly, their features softening. When she finished, the room was silent. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of history lifted slightly, though not entirely gone. Eleanor stepped forward. "The past has been acknowledged," she said. "The darkness has been faced. But the story must live, so that it is never repeated." Amelia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will carry it, and I will share it. The world will know what happened here. The victims will not be forgotten." Eleanor's form began to fade, merging with the light until all that remained was a sense of peace. The shadows in the corners of the room had vanished. Amelia felt the mansion breathe, as if exhaling after centuries of tension. She carefully gathered the artifacts, the diary, and ledger, preparing to leave the mansion. Outside, the sun was rising, casting warm light over the orchard and the overgrown grounds. The storm had passed, leaving a clear sky and the promise of a new beginning. Amelia knew her journey was not over. The mansion's horrors had been confronted, but the world still needed to know. She would take the truth to historians, to descendants, and to anyone willing to listen. The Rutledge Mansion had taught her that confronting darkness required bravery, persistence, and honesty. She stepped onto the path leading away from the mansion, feeling the weight of generations behind her and the freedom of knowledge ahead. The Rutledge Mansion would no longer be a place of fear, but a reminder, a warning, a lesson, and a story to be told. Amelia looked back one last time. The mansion stood silent, its secrets revealed and its ghosts released. The final chapter of the dark history had been written, but the lessons would live on. As the wind carried away the last whispers, Amelia whispered to herself, "The truth will be remembered, and justice, in some small way, has been done." If you were captivated by Amelia's journey and the chilling secrets of the Rutledge Mansion, make sure to support our channel, subscribe for more dark historical mysteries, share this video with friends who love true horror, and leave a comment below telling us which part of this story sent chills down your spine. The past has many voices, and together we will hear them all.